So this is Andy Revkin. This is my Sustain What webcast, in which I use conversation to try to navigate complexity when we're facing consequential decisions and issues. And I frequently that process involves the intersection of science and the public and people who make decisions. Of course, we all make decisions, but there are people who make bigger decisions. And we're in a world right now that seems to be going from a perspective of someone who understood the Enlightenment. It feels like we're going in a dark direction, and it's important to understand the dynamics there. How much is the responsibility of science? How much is the responsibility of the rest of us? How do we make more informed choices? And there was this recent commentary in Nature that got my attention. I think I saw it first. Musa had posted it on LinkedIn, and I thought I would pull together the authors and have a quick reprise of what prompted this. It's a pretty significant collection of people getting together, and what the hope is for it. We could sort of walk through the key points, the 6 ways to put the public at the heart of science and policy. I will premise this with, 40 years in science journalism. It feels sometimes to me like Isaac Asimov wrote this short story called Nightfall decades ago, and it was turned into a really, really, really bad movie by Roger Corman, and in which scientists understand that they reveal that the planet has 3 suns, so people have never experienced night. But they think that a triple eclipse is coming, and there will be night, and no one really wants to believe it. And then, of course, night is starting to fall, and what do? They storm the observatory, and there's fires and chaos. And I hope that's not where we're going. So please rescue me. Maybe KL, you could introduce yourself and start. Explain briefly who you are, what your vantage point is, and then we'll do the other 2, and then get into the project.
Great, no, thank you. That's great to join for this discussion. So this project in this article started as a workshop that we held in fall 2026. And the question we were asking was, what does communicating science for policy look like in an age of populism? And I think the neat thing, and you can see, and you'll hear from Musa and Chris momentarily on their perspectives. But we're obviously seeing populism come up in different forms all over the globe. And the really interesting thing too is people are responding in different ways. How can we address, science and technology is changing our lives really, really rapidly. So how can we have better conversations and with decision makers, but also with the public about what this future is going to look like and what do we want it to look like? And so I think that's the really exciting thing, is the thing that we heard, and I hope you can see in this commentary that a big group led, was that there are a lot of interesting innovations all over the world that we can learn from for how do we have these conversations better and make sure we are heading towards the pathway, where we would like to go. So with that, I'll toss it off to,
let's go to Chris. Who are you? What do you do day by day, and what drew you into this?
Thanks. Yeah, Chris Tyler. I'm an academic at UCL, University College London, in a department which has an obscenely long title called Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. We go by STEEP. My background isn't really so much in academia as in the practice of doing science advice. I ran UK Parliament Science Advisory Unit for 5 years. I set up the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. And I've been working with KL for a long time now, talking about science advice and trying to really bring science advice as a discipline into the modern era. We've been doing it the same way for 40, 50 years. And AI is beginning to change that. And I think this populism angle is a really important context for trying to modernize science advice. It isn't just an instrumental thing. It's the underlying philosophy of what we're trying to do needs reevaluation. And the sort of starting point from this is, as KL said, was the workshop thinking about science advice and populism. And I've got a very sort of strong feeling that the scientific community with respect to populism needs to quit being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. And there are these models out there for how we can do better. And we thought we'd just put a few of those down in this commentary to kickstart a conversation and see if we can't start shifting the needle a little bit on how the research community is approaching the questions it's asking, who it's talking to, how it's thinking about evidence, and then how that is translated into a sphere of public decision making.
So over to you, Musa. Stony Brook and currently in the White Mountains. Tell me, you were on my show a couple of years ago talking about scientists' reticence sometimes to tell the full truth. It's something that I've written about and drew on Mike Hume's work on the climatism, etc. So what pulled you in? Just explain a little bit again for those who haven't met you, what you do and then how you got into this.
Yeah, I'm a sociologist by training. I do sociology of knowledge, cognitive sociology, but I'm in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. And my work focuses a lot on the political economy of knowledge and culture institutions. My first book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, looked at these changes in knowledge and culture institutions over the past 10 years, how they've grown in many ways kind of more distant from a lot of the rest of society, especially on moral and cultural issues, and explored some of the consequences of that kind of growing gulf. I'm working on a second book called Those People right now, which will kind of continue that story. And I first got folded into this project because, well, I've been a fan of KL's for a long time, and we've been internet friends, but we've never had a chance to like work together until she kicked off this this conference and working group, and so she invited me to be a part of it, and yeah, that's how we started working together, and it's been great.
And I thought maybe we'll start briefly with a sense of how quote unquote bad things are. And just as to set the table, and you do this in the piece, but just a couple of days ago, the president went on the warpath against the National Academy of Sciences for some of the work it's approved and been involved with related to climate change, and he says the Academy has been run by radical left Democrats who, it turns out, published fraudulent, biased, and misleading manuals on climate change. This is for federal judges. Now, it's very easy for those of us who define themselves as progressive or liberal to just say, oh, what a moron, and how dare he, and he's just fomenting the kind of distrust we're all talking about. But there are issues here. There are issues. There are real issues with how the academies have worked on both the federal manual and the new report they just did on attribution science for climate. How much of the hurricane was from fossil fuel pollution, which will end up in courtrooms. So maybe we could talk about. Can you maybe start with KL? Do you have a sense, and do you articulate through this working group, how important it is for institutions and for scientists to realize that there's not issues just on one side of this spectrum?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the main message we are really trying to bring home with that commentary and with the workshop, and I will say this project also related to a book project we've also got on that Chris is a part of and a number of groups. It's an international project in communicating science for policy. We are really trying to emphasize that the research community needs to listen to other voices, and I think that's one thing that unfortunately sometimes gets lost is that the public policy literature is crystal clear. If you think about wicked problems, if you think about structured versus unstructured problems, that a lot of the issues that we deal with, especially in the environmental community, but pretty much every single big social issue that has a science or technology related aspect of it, there's some level of uncertainty in the science, and there is public disagreement on what it is people would like to do. What is that future would they have liked? And you can't just say, well, we're going to bring in the scientists and have them make a decision when there's some level of uncertainty in the science and people don't agree on what direction we should go. And you have to have conversations with decision makers and their constituents about what this looks like. And unfortunately, I think sometimes the research community is like, well, we know the answer, but maybe they don't fully know the answer, right? Most of that is a lot of the science that we need to use for social problems is heavily interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary. So usually one discipline doesn't own it. One person doesn't own it. And so, I mean, it can seem really easy, like, I know the answer, so why aren't we doing this? When in fact, we need these types of processes that bring people together, have conversations, fish out, well, what is the evidence we actually need? Where does the certainty lie in that evidence? Where are we trying to go? Where can we all agree that it's a good direction? But we're not trained to do that in universities, right? We don't tell graduate students how to do it. Faculty have no idea, and there's no money to do it. So, we basically, and I think that's what we're really actually trying to argue in another conversation we're having, that we really need to discuss how we're going to institutionalize these practices and bring together government and universities and communities in ways that really actually are constructive. And allow people to listen and hear and understand and work together collaboratively to get us all to the right, to sort of where we can all be, nobody's always going to agree, but at least get us generally in a direction where folks would like to go.
Can one of you articulate an example of an institution that is flawed? What does that look like? And then also one that works. What's a model of a better way to do this? I don't know.
Well, to piggyback off here, I'll have Chris take the part of the models that work, because I know he's really fluent in this. But I'll just kick off this conversation by saying, like, the way that you frame the question about how there are real challenges here. So there is a lot of research that shows that scientists often understate, as KL said, the extent of disagreement or uncertainty. And they do this because they have this naive understanding that if they are forward about uncertainty, if they're forward about disagreement, that people will trust them less or comply with them less. But there's actually a lot of research that shows that when people are more candid about uncertainty and disagreement, it actually makes people trust them more. So a lot of scientists are kind of running on this, on these kind of naive assumptions about how people think and believe. They're not empirically backed, so they're kind of speaking on behalf of the science, but the ways that they approach public engagement are often not actually evidence-based. And so this is a real big problem. Another problem is, as you said, people often do, scientists, when they're communicating with the public, often do rely on the most dramatic model. So often there's kind of multiple models that are produced, multiple scenarios for how things could go. And we often, in public communications, often rely on the most dramatic model, the most dire scenarios. And again, often they do this because they think if they really show that if you don't make changes, these really horrific things will happen, that this will lead people to take action more. But in fact, we know, people who work in communication and behavior know that what often happens when you make these really dramatic claims is it feeds into fatalism. People think, well, okay, it looks like we're doomed, so there's nothing that we can do, and it actually makes people less likely to take action. So there's just a whole bunch of ways in which, because the scientific community, as KL said, is not is often not really trained in how people think and process information and how to communicate, especially in how to communicate with non-specialists. They often communicate in ways that are counterproductive towards their aspirations. So that's some of the ways in which it can go awry. And I'll let Chris take the point in discussing some positive models.
And before you start, I have to observe that one of my regrets as a journalist is that I didn't understand that literature. Journalists kind of just dive into this thing called journalism. Most of us learn how to write, learn if you go to journalism school, but you're not thinking, and our headlines and our front page thinking also amplifies the same things that you're just describing. So, Chris, best case institutions, and I'll bring up some other questions. Obviously, this is great.
Yeah, sure. So to take this, before framing that, to sort of take it back to your initial kind of question about how bad is it, it kind of depends a little bit on where you are, and the US certainly is having a rough time with populism with respect compared to the rest of the democratic world. Certainly big democracies, and in Europe we have a very different relationship with populism because of combination of the sort of long run history and voting mechanisms and so on that we have here. I'm going to give one example of public participation feeding into research that work really well. So the European Union pools its money for big research programs, and it's billions of euros every year, in what's called its Horizon program. And its Horizon 2020 budget, in the run up to that, one of the partners actually who wrote this article with us, Democracy X, Bjorn Bedstedt, led a program exploring how the public felt about this research program. So there were two parallel tracks. There was a consultation with experts, and the experts felt really strongly about new technologies and energy transitions and industrial strategy and those kinds of things. But when they spoke to the public, there was much more concern around things around community and health and education and so on. And by putting those two things together, it's not that you pick one or the other. It was then the job of the civil servants to build those priorities and those values alongside the expertise into a coherent program. And I think they did a fantastic job of that. Now, you can do these kind of participatory things in universities, and you can do them in decision-making institutions. And in this case, they did it with a third-party intermediary. One of the things that we grapple with in this article is the fact that the incentive structure within universities is globally not great. And another good example of where we have managed to kind of move in the right direction is in the UK, where our funding for universities comes through sort of two major government funding streams. One is competitive research grants, and the other is in block grants that go to universities. In the block grants, there's a research framework that all universities have to go through every 7 years, where they report on what they've been doing, and that large part is about the excellence of the research that they're doing. But a big chunk of the money is set aside and judged on how impactful our universities have been in society, including public participation and everything through to working with decision makers. So in the UK, there is a very strong incentive structure within universities to build institutions that enable engagement between academics, training them up in how to engage with public policy decision makers and to engage with the public. Now, money hasn't flown into that as quickly as some would like, but the fact that we've got these incentive structures means that we've got dozens of universities now that have some kind of mechanism for doing public policy engagement. They're connected in this body called UPenn, University Policy Engagement Network. They work across the breadth and width of the UK collaboratively to increase the impact of their researchers. And I think the next natural step in that kind of model is to then, on top of that public policy engagement, to build in public engagement as part of that process, not leave it as a separate thing. At the moment, it's kind of tucked away as its own discipline, and it's important that there are people who really understand that discipline because they do it brilliantly. But what we're arguing for here is that the university system, among others, needs to build together the research expertise, the public policy expertise, and the public participation expertise together as a three-legged stool to really to have impact and move the research community forward in a way that is most impactful and most beneficial for society.
What's the biggest lesson that came out of the way expertise handled the COVID pandemic, maybe from a European perspective and US and others? I have to think that that's come up in your working group. I mean,
very much so. Yeah, we the UK system, we have I mean, just focus on the UK and then I'll broaden it out to Europe, if I may. But in the UK, we have a government chief scientist. So our prime minister is advised by an individual who has a support team, and their primary job is convening relevant expertise. And then we have this mechanism for how to leverage that in an emergency situation. And it's worked pretty well in the past. Other countries have started to mimic it. But one of the things that it didn't do well in this instance is that in a sort of longer running emergency, there was a lack of transparency in the system that sort of didn't really work. It works in a very kind of like short, sharp emergency, like just pull people together, make some decisions, get some advice, push it through, and then we'll worry about the transparency down the road. And this, because it was a longer burn of an emergency, required new mechanisms for building in transparency. And the lack of transparency became a really big trust issue. Now, the researchers and the science advisors had a higher level of trust with the community than the politicians did. And the politicians tried to kind of leverage that by saying, well, we'll be led by the science, we'll be led by the science. But when it became clear that the science wasn't transparent, you started to see that trust erode. So they took steps to improve that. Now, not all countries in Europe took the same approach. Not a federal system like the US here, where everyone's in a different country with their own different governance systems.
Yeah.
Lots of countries took extremely different approaches. Some took very, very hard lockdown approaches. Others took much more sort of liberal kind of like, we trust you to make good decisions as citizens type approaches, like Sweden famously did. And to be honest, I think we're still unpicking the results of that. There's been very interesting work written on it, some of which feeds into the book that KL was talking about that will be coming out later this year, early next year. And I do think that as a whole, the science advisory community will be better placed to deal with the next big emergency. Every single time we have an emergency, we learn about it and get a little bit better.
Yeah. There was what's his name? There was a book called The Long Emergency that came out a long time ago. The title of which seems very durable these days.
Right.
Musa, here in the States again, not just COVID, but so many things now since the vaccine issue just keeps on resonating. Measles pops up and this government handles it so differently than previous administrations. And now we have cyclosporosis and fingers are wagging. And what's distinct here? And then over to UKL in terms of this point. And there are some other points. Obviously, this call for 6 actions. We have to get through some of the other parts of the list. But so, Musa, what's wrong with America right now?
Good luck, Musa.
Well, so for me, when you asked that question, actually, earlier about COVID and the COVID response, one of the places my mind went to actually was that I think there was a lot of things that went wrong before the outbreak of COVID-19 that really fed into a lot of the dysfunction we saw in the States during the pandemic. So, for instance, I've talked about this a little bit in some of my articles, but one of the things that scientists did after Donald Trump was elected was they engaged in this in the March for Science, and the March for Science was a set of activities where scientists, often wearing white coats and like explicitly presenting themselves as scientists, were putting basically science over here, Trump over here, and you have to pick. Was basically the message, the implicit message of the March for Science is that the science was hostile towards the, or there's just this kind of antithetical relationship between the science and the Republican administration, and so there's a political scientist, Matt Moda, who did this research to find out what were the effects of the March for Science, because Trump was a very polarizing figure. Scientists at that time were held in pretty high esteem, and so he wondered, did the March for Science make people like scientists more, trust Trump less, and so on? What he found is that the main effect of the March for Science was that it cause people to trust scientists less. And this is for a bunch of reasons. What we can see a lot in polls and surveys is that the public absolutely does want scientists to weigh in to provide information and context on matters related to public policy and their areas of expertise. But they want scientists to be engaging with the public as kind of neutral arbiters who are just who are giving people, who are equipping other stakeholders to make decisions, not as referees trying to put their thumb on the scale for one faction or another. And when scientists start doing that, people tend to trust science less and scientists less. And so this polarizing set of behaviors was really unfortunate, because these declines in trust in scientists and this polarization around expertise that happened in the wake of the March for Science kicked off right before the outbreak of a major global pandemic, where trust in science and scientists was important. And I think there was a lot of lessons to learn about the way that the scientific community did messaging and interacted with the public and tried to respond to the pandemic, for sure. But I think we were in a kind of an awkward spot even before a lot of those mistakes were made here in the United States, in part because there was this the pandemic occurred in this moment of already heightened mistrust and contestation around scientists. And last thing I'll say really quick, I mean, one of the big takeaways from our paper in Nature is that these populist moments certainly present a lot of challenges for scientific institutions, for experts, but they also can be moments of opportunity to make reforms that are overdue and needed. And one of the things that we do note in the paper is a lot of institutions, like across the world, when countries have been facing this populist pushback, one of the things that they consistently have done in a lot of arenas is adopt this kind of resistance posture, circling the wagons, deriding people who have suspicion of of institutions or messages as kind of brainwashed, stupid, zealots, and so on. And here again, there's just tons and tons of research that shows that one, the main effect of trying to shame people and relying on these kinds of negative messages about people who disagree with you is it causes blowback. It causes people to move in the opposite direction of what you want them to. And then the last thing I'll say is one problem with institutions and scientists kind of positioning themselves as an opposition to populist movements and populist leaders especially, is that it makes it even harder. It kind of reinforces a lot of the dynamics we're concerned about. So if you're Donald Trump And most mainstream experts refuse to work in your administration or define themselves in opposition to you and are like explicitly opposed to everything that you purportedly stand for, well, then who can you rely on to make decisions that require expert advice? Well, you can't rely on the mainstream experts. They refuse to engage with you. They refuse to work with you. They're hostile to you. So who do you have to rely on? Well, you end up relying on a bunch of kooks and hacks and non-experts and so on. And so it's really important for institutions and experts to make themselves to really emphasize that they're there to serve everyone in society, even people that they don't particularly love, and to the extent that they don't do that, to the extent that they position themselves as being unwilling to serve particular political factions or particular constituencies in the country, this is often something that foments mistrust, exacerbates polarization, and so on.
Yeah, can I just jump off the back of that, Musa?
Yeah, of course.
The way you framed it there is really, really good. And I would just add that in a sort of slightly simplistic way, that I think the research community as a whole, and more widely the sort of social elite that populists lash out against, have over the last decade or two, as populism has risen, have distracted themselves with telling people what they should care about rather than helping to solve problems. And that's where that disjunction really, if I was to like really simplify and characterize it, I think that's really what we're talking about here. It's, when I referred to the Horizon 2020 process earlier, it wasn't that what the EU didn't do was say to the public, why do you care about communities? Sod off, we're just going to do our own research programs around building hubs for innovation. What they did was say, oh, well, people care about communities and the experts care about innovation, hubs for innovation. How can we put those two things together and actually provide workable solutions? And actually, if you think about a lot of the frustration that the elites have with the populist movement, half of it is what they're caring about. Sometimes people, it's very easy for the elites to say immigration doesn't matter. Well, it simply does matter to some people. But what to do about it is something that we can legitimately help with. Some of the solutions that are being put forward by populists simply won't achieve the things that they want to achieve. That's where researchers can really help. We stop telling people what to feel, stop telling people what values they should have, and help actually solve problems in meaningful and equitable ways. That's if we want, the article ends with, I think, a very simple statement that kind of is embedded all the way through this, which is that the public will start to trust the elites once the elites start to trust the publics.
Right.
One thing
sorry.
One thing I'll just throw in quickly. I think one thing we also need to be really careful is that we don't equate populism with any specific end of the political spectrum, because we are definitely seeing, so just an example, right? I think it's pretty widely acknowledged that in the 2016 presidential election, a bunch of folks who would have voted for Bernie Sanders actually voted for Trump. And even Trump has acknowledged that. And we are certainly seeing, I would say, pretty strong strains of populist discourse on the progressive left. So I think we got to be a little bit careful, because I mean, there is this assumption, especially in the United States, right, that the issue is that all the professors, especially social scientists, perhaps in academia, are all Democrats, right? And that's the problem. But I would actually argue that that's kind of a super, I mean, I'm not saying that isn't the problem. And actually that was one of the reasons I reached out to Musa initially, is because I think we like understanding to what extent we really are seeing, sort of ideological consistency as opposed to diversity and across universities is an interesting question. And how do we think about it and what do we do about it? But I think more widely, when we think about populism, I think we need to not just say, well, it's just Donald Trump and then, hey, he's going to be gone and then we don't have an issue, right? That this is something that's deeply happening within societies all over the globe. I would argue in part because there's a lot of uncertainty and people feel like the system's rigged. Like there's some real reasons why you might be not happy with institutions right now and why you really might be concerned, right, about your own, what's going to happen to you in your life and your children. And I think we need to say, okay, again, we need to listen and understand. So what is the role that universities play? What is the role that research communities play in what is a massive transition that's happening in societies all across the globe right now? And to be honest, it's spurred in large part, right, by technology and changes in science.
Yeah.
Can I double click on one quick point on this? So this point Kale made is just super important. So I just wanted to double click it real quick and note that, for instance, there was an article of mine I saw on the screen a bit ago about who's vaccine hesitant and why. And one of the things that you see very clearly in the literature there is that a lot of the populations in the United States, for instance, just to stick with this example, that are vaccine hesitant are also populations that tend to vote Democrat at high levels. So African Americans, for instance, and other ethnic and religious minorities are especially likely to be vaccine hesitant. They're also especially likely to vote Democrat. And so it's just not the case that there's all mistrust of science and scientific institutions is kind of right-leaning, and it's also not the case, as Kale said, that populist movements are a uniquely right-leaning phenomenon either. There's a lot of left-wing populism as well. So I just really appreciate that.
Can I just add one thing to that too? One thing you will also see, and it's really well established in the data, is that actually pockets of vaccine resistance are also in university towns. There is a specific type of folks who actually know a lot about vaccines who don't totally love the way that they're done and have some, so you actually do see it among really highly educated as well. So but we smeared everybody into one group and say, oh, they're vaccine hesitant. Yeah, and not understanding why they might hold those perspectives.
Oh no, I've lived with that back in the Hudson River Valley where we lived for 30 years. So we have close friends who, I don't think they have AHA bumper stickers, but they're definitely deeply liberal and definitely think that the radiation from cell towers is killing their children. So it's definitely, I've experienced, I'm sure many people have experienced the nonpartisan nature of some of these divisions. And I think that gets back to, the multiple dimensions we're all dealing with of this issue of science, uncertainty, rapid change. And the one thing I wanted to bring up is what happens when populism generates authoritarianism. And now we have an administration that's ignoring judicial rulings, that's making fundamentally unscientific positions. We were just talking earlier about the Endangered Species Act, which was created under Nixon administration, along with the EPA and everything. And now the Trump administration has abruptly said, a species, you can't kill a species with a gun, but you can take away its habitat so that it dies. So we're just surrounded by this over and over and over again. And so how much is that more unitary executive lack of true democratic controls relate to what we're, to the way forward here? And I think you've all indicated the way forward is not necessarily electing someone other than President Trump. But that's, I don't know, it feels like that's part of it. It's not just the populists, but it's also the administrative control that we're seeing. I don't know who that resonates for here.
So one of the things I've argued in some of my work is I think that in this moment especially, institutions have to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. There's kind of two things that we need to do. On the one hand, we do need to defend our institutions, right? So we need to explain why you shouldn't just burn down universities, why it is that the autonomy that we enjoy is important and should be maintained, why we should have academic freedom, why it shouldn't just eliminate freedom of the press. We do need to defend our institutions and explain their value and demonstrate their value. At the same time, however, we do need to acknowledge and meaningfully try to address some of the ways in which our institutions have in fact been failing a lot of people and have not been serving huge swaths of the population. It's important to do both of those things at the same time, because what I often stress to people is that if you're someone who has concerns about institutions and the way they're functioning in society and whether people like you have a voice or a stake in those institutions, and you basically get two messages in response to your concern. The one set of messages is, there's nothing to see here. Everything, these institutions are great, actually. And the only reason you would think they're not great is if you're stupid, racist, sexist, authoritarian, fill in the blanks. If that's one set of messages you receive. And then the other set of messages you receive is, you know what? You're absolutely right. These institutions, they don't serve you. They don't respect you. And you know what? You can't trust them to change. They're never even going to acknowledge the problems, let alone address them. What you need to do is give me a chainsaw, flamethrower, whatever, and I'll burn these institutions down or whip them into shape. If those are the two messages that voters receive, and in fact, they often are the two messages that voters receive, that second one is going to win a lot, because the first message, the nothing to see here message, actually affirms the second message that will never even acknowledge the problems, let alone address them. And so it's really important for us to simultaneously acknowledge some of the ways in which our institutions have not been serving parts of society, while also defending those institutions. And then the last thing I'll say that's kind of related to the last comment I made is that as we're responding to some of the challenges that we're facing, it's important for us to respond as experts, as academics, as scientists, that is to say, upholding the virtues and values that the public expects of us, of being nonpartisan, of being willing and interested in serving all members of the population, of being arbiters who give other stakeholders the tools and decisions they make rather than putting our thumbs on the scale. It's really important for us to embody those, because otherwise, again, we're providing ammunition for the people who are describing us as a bunch of partisan hacks, right? So I think it's just really important for us to actually uphold our best ideals and values, to defend our institutions, and but then also to acknowledge some of the ways in which maybe they haven't been performing as well as they could, and work to do better.
I'm pointing here. I have, just so you know, here's a list of some of your key points, which Gemini helped me generate. Speaking of, but it is it's a pretty good list of the key points. Scaling that issue, that the opportunity, we'll call it an opportunity that Musa just articulated, still seems really hard when you get down to the path-dependent nature of so much of the institutions we're in. Years ago, 5 years ago, I had a discussion here with 8 postdocs who had co-authored a piece in Nature Sustainability, a commentary on what academia can do to foster better outcomes for sustainability science. And the list was totally logical. We need more time because interdisciplinary work requires us to talk to each other. For community-based science, we need more time to talk to the community and develop fluency and trust. But all of these things also felt at that time really hard to concretize, to really shift. And so I just want to make that point before we get into the scaling. And as a journalist, I tend to be kind of grumpy and skeptical. But I like what you're saying. But maybe each of you can articulate a little bit about how we could see this play out in the real world.
Maybe. I'll just say really quickly, I mean, I think It is no secret that the federal government could use some change to improve. Right there, you look back, right, back way to Al Gore, et cetera, right? I mean, there have been waves of folks of different parties who've all said, yeah, we need to improve the federal government. And I think one of the also places which is like just still shocks me, I was down in Richmond last week, right? Most of our legislatures at the state level are part-time. Those people have other jobs, which they do. And actually, and as especially as we devolve all these decisions down to the states, we have folks like in the state of Virginia who only sit between, it alternates between 45 and 60 days when they're making decisions on thousands of bills, right?
Mm.
The reality, and then we are expecting them to make decisions about very highly technical matters like data centers and environmental issues and health, right? Making sure people get health in rural areas with when they actually are having to be back at home and have other jobs. And that's happening all across the country. So last thing that I'll say, so we need institutional change, not just at the federal government level, right? To be able to, and you're seeing lots of people who have been pushing those over recent years. Like, how do we incorporate AI and think about that? How are we going to be using it? How are we still regulating it, right? But how do we use evidence is really, really important as S&T is part and parcel almost all of our decisions, but we need people who are making these decisions full time across the states. And then the last point I'll make, the other really sad thing, which I think actually plays a big role in my guess, is that, and I'm sure you guys will know from the communication standpoint, is that as we've lost our news ecosystems, what has really suffered is the local and state level news. It's almost like I do try and point my students to the Virginia American News and other sources, but most people do not see local and state news anymore, which means they have no idea who those people are who are representing them, and they have no idea what policy looks like at those levels, which makes it also very hard to vote. So we've become very disconnected from these systems, and I think that's one of the real opportunities for universities can assist with institutionalization is they can become a hub for these discussions. They can become a hub for meeting these people and having, and information flows, and bringing evidence together with decision making on various different levels of government. So, I think there is a happy medium there, but it's like a confluence of issues that are making it very, very hard for people to understand how institutions are serving them and to make, to actually vote in ways that would support better governance.
Yeah. So maybe Chris.
Yeah, tangentially but connected. I think that if there's one kind of big take home from the piece of all the 6 things that we talked about, they all lead up to scale. It's KL talked about federal and state issues, and that's absolutely right. The people in charge of decision making need to take the responsibility of that very seriously, and at the bare minimum that means getting your facts straight. However, I do think that universities have historically massively underplayed the value that they can provide to that process and not taken seriously the institutional change required to actually deliver on that responsibility. If universities don't have the right to turn around looking at government decision making and say you need to hire intermediaries that build bridges between academia and policy and not do the same themselves. You can't trust academics to, as an entire group to simply behave as if they don't have their own values and their own biases. A lot of them will conflate the facts of the situation with their own particular set of values. And that's why we hire intermediaries in public policy, to try and mitigate some of that confusion and complexity, and try and help people to act as much as possible as honest brokers rather than as lobbyists. We should be empowering decision makers to make the best decisions that they can, and the research community should be acting as much as possible as honest brokers in that process. And in order to do that, it needs to professionalize. It isn't just enough to professionalize and be awesome at research. You need to also professionalize on being honest brokers. And that's something that I think globally we are woefully behind on. And incentive structures absolutely need to change in order to prioritize scaling up.
One thing I want to introduce here, years ago, I got to know Nancy Holt, who was a young researcher in New York City, who founded something called Science for New York. It's like Science #4 New York. And it was mainly focused on getting young scientists to get out into their communities, to understand the ecosystem of decision-making, to go to your local borough board meeting, or and not just with your presentation, but just to be a member of the community. And that feels scalable to me because it's individual action. How much of this is less about institutions and more about, working with young scientists, particularly, or older people, and just having them, fostering their capacity to be a citizen who is a scientist, as distinct from a scientist coming in to give a talk, to say, we need this policy.
Yeah, I'm sure I'd love to hear from KL and Musa on this, but I'll just jump in first from a sort of international perspective, if I may. It's both. So one of the things, when in an earlier draft of the piece, we were talking about institutionalizing a lot of this need for public participation in research and science advice. And some of the pushback was, but we don't have the funding for it, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And overwhelmingly, the people involved in writing this were like, oh, no, we didn't mean just institutionalize, but get out and do it. And there's actually a line in there, I can't remember where in the piece, saying, if you've got some research that involves public opinion, go and talk to some people. Like, as a first step, go to a public meeting, talk to a politician, talk to the local cabbie who's driving you around London, talk to your mum, like whatever, like get out and talk to people. It's not that complicated. And at a bare minimum, be engaged. And that will help with the broader issue of institutionalizing. Cultural change doesn't happen at one level, it happens at all levels. And we need not just the top-down solutions, we need the bottom-up solutions as well.
Musa?
Oh, sure. So, I think on the one hand, one of the things that's really great about like a mistake that people often make when they think about relationships with the public, and this is one of the things we stress in the paper, is even when they think about engagement with larger stakeholders other than their peer academics, the first thing that they think of is, well, okay, how can we get these other people to do what we want? So it's kind of a one-way model in their mind of like, how can we, the experts, get the public to do what we want, rather than how can we have some humility and come to other stakeholders and actually learn from them and have their perspectives and their concerns shape what we do and shape how we think about and understand social problems and stuff. And so one of the real values of going out into the community and engaging with stakeholders in this way is that you can learn a lot about you can get a much richer sense of both the problems that you're trying to address and also what kind of solution sets might work for those problems. I'll just make two quick notes. One of them is that I think even as it relates to public engagement, a lot of academics, when they think about public engagement, the first thing they think about is like, oh, well, let me write an op-ed for the New York Times or the Atlantic. And, that's fine. I do that a lot. But I think it is important to understand that when you look at the reader base, as I show in my book, if you look at the reader base of outlets like the New York Times or the Atlantic, they look actually very similar. Like the people who are producing articles for the New York Times and the Atlantic and the people who are consuming articles from the New York Times and the Atlantic are basically the same narrow subset of the population: highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban, white liberal people. So if you're trying to reach someone who's not that, then it's important that you think about reaching out beyond those venues. So I do write for those kind of outlets, but I also do talks at churches. I do talks at public libraries. I do talks at senior citizen centers, actually. And so I think it's important to think about both levers. That you can pull and institutions that you can work with, looking at things like local media. So as KL mentioned correctly, a lot of local media is under strain, but there are still local newspapers. And the beauty of working with local newspapers is, one, you're reaching constituents in your own community a lot more directly than if you write for like the New York Times, especially if you're trying to persuade local stakeholders. Then looking at local media will be a more targeted messaging to the stakeholders you're trying to persuade. But on top of that, people tend to trust local media more than national media. So even a lot of people who are mistrustful about the press writ large like their local newspaper. And you see this effect actually in a lot of different scenarios where people like the more local instantiation of that thing a lot more than they like the national version of it. And then the last thing I'll say is, even when we're trying to persuade, a lot of the messaging that experts and institutions rely on is not actually persuasive in form. Like, it's not actually structured to persuade. So persuasion, at a minimum, entails talking to people who don't already agree with you in a way that they will find compelling. So not in the way that you find most satisfying, not in the way that you find most attractive, but in a way that will resonate with them, speaking to their values, their concerns, their priorities, their ways of understanding the world. Okay, and you have to go where the fish are. So again, if I'm trying to persuade, if I think that conservatives are the obstacle to achieving some goal, then I need to go to right-leaning spaces and talk to conservatives in a way that they'll find persuasive. So I do this. I write for the Guardian, and I'm a columnist for the Guardian and so on, but I also write for the National Review and the American Conservative. But as Chris said, there are these unfortunate incentive structures in a lot of our institutions where, for a lot of my colleagues, if they had to choose between producing purely sterile work or having a byline with their name on it in the American Conservative, they would choose the purely sterile work, because if you have a byline with your name on it in the American Conservative, in a lot of our institutions, your colleagues will look on you not as someone who's like, oh, you're reaching out across and trying to like move the meter, but they'll go, oh, you're writing for the American Conservative, you must, this kind of marks you for suspicion in some way. And so there are these kind of unfortunate dynamics within a lot of our institutions that inhibit our ability to do genuinely persuasive work. But yeah.
That's great. Well, this is all really valuable. Yeah.
Jump in. So one thing, I just want to push back a little bit on the idea that this is actually just easy to go out and talk to the community. And I think you can actually do damage, true damage, by assuming that everybody's just going to be so thrilled to see you and talk to you, and that, by the way, their time is invaluable. So, and unfortunately, I mean, I think it's probably pretty well known, right? Academia is not totally representative of all communities. And they're particularly, unfortunately, probably not representative of those communities that are sometimes going to get thwacked the most from, whether it's extreme weather, right, economic conditions, policy, et cetera, right? They're having the hardest time, right? Those are the exact people that academia is probably, those folks are least likely to understand what their lives are like. They are least likely to have any natural connections with them, like to have them already on their, text train. And the problem is that we already do this when you already messed it up. So we did a project, it was NSF funded, on equitable co-production. By the way, this was a huge effort. Also, we saw enormous effort by Biden administration to really make sure that government agencies were doing co-production. And we're doing with communities that we're going to we're really going to be impacted by the types of policies. So there's been a big push to do this better, which I think is really important. I'm not saying we can't do that. I'm just saying we need to be really careful. So one of the communities that we talked to, that I'd gone through, we talked to different communities in different places in the country that had done equitable co-production projects as part with federal agencies. And one of them was the Rockaways. one of the things that we heard from the people organizing there, right, is this is a really diverse community. But they're folks who are right, who are maybe having more economic challenges, right? Who, and by the way, the reason why researchers are showing up on their doorsteps is they got just whacked by a storm, right? An incredibly traumatic event. And then they get everybody from Princeton to Harvard to state universities, all those researchers show up on the doors of these people and they knock on the door and say, I just really want to talk to you. Guess what? Those folks, right? And like literally you're putting them through PTSD. And they have a lot of other things to do in their lives. Or the other way this often happens, and as I've said, I think researchers are totally well-meaning, but they invite these people to a community event to talk about this and what they want to do, right? They and the problem is often there's no pay to pay for their childcare, right? They offer it in times when these people probably need to be working. And again, these people are getting invited to a lot of these different things. So, and fortunately, the exact communities that are ready to have these conversations are the ones that have organizations that are already highly funded, have high administration, and who have representatives who are ready to talk with researchers all day, right? The communities that we really need to reach out to don't have that infrastructure. And that's another reason why institutionalization is so important, and why I actually don't think that just throwing researchers out into these communities is the greatest idea. And I will point another thing that I worry about is that often those folks are not social scientists. I'm not saying social scientists are perfect on this by a long shot, but I have seen examples where we have natural and physical scientists who've never heard of IRB or human subjects research. And they go out and they collect human subjects data, which, by the way, has a bunch of federal legal implications, depending on how it was done. So we actually, if universities want to do this, they also need to support the people in doing it and know something about what they're doing and make sure that we are essentially not being seen as extractive. But that we are figuring out ways to support these communities, get money to them if they're going to participate in these conversations, help them build infrastructure so that their voices are heard, but are in ways that are not where we're just getting the sentences that we need to put in our reports. So anyway, sorry.
No, that's such an important point. I have seen scientists try to go into public and really make things worse. Yes, this happens. I'm sure that Chris and Musa have too. Maybe one last thought from each of you, because we're I don't want to take up the rest of your time. We can do more on this. Maybe I could reach out to Nancy Holt, and there's a comedian, Chuck Nice, who works with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has spoken in depth about public engagement in science, and he comes from an interesting perspective. But we can do more. But maybe a last thought. Scalability, I would love it. Money, as you mentioned, resources, I would love it. Figuring out where there are existing models that can replicate or be kind of integrated in different places across the Atlantic, for example, is great. And just so I hope people are reading your paper. Maybe just a last thought from Chris and then from Musa, and we'll move on to the rest of the day.
Well, thanks for pulling this conversation together. I really appreciate it. I do think this is at an important time to be having this conversation. In America, I spend lots of time in America and I love it there. But one of the things I've always noticed is that Americans are very, very focused on America. There's a lot going on in the outside world that can be very useful for folks in the US. In this space. And one of the things that we really wanted to do with this piece was to bring together a really international group of people to have that conversation. To widen the criticism, the Global North is very, very focused on the Global North. And again, in this piece, we really privileged to be able to bring together people from the Global South to contribute their considerations on this. And actually, there's some fantastic examples of best practice that we should be taking from places that simply don't have the resources. So when someone in the US or the UK tells you that they're not doing this because they don't have the resource, nonsense. There's people in the global south who've figured out ways to do this much better than we have in all sorts of tough situations. So I want to sort of leave it with a kind of upbeat notion that this is doable. Like, we can scale this. There are ways to do it. There are models of best practice. There are models of institutionalization that we can follow. What this takes is leadership. And we've taken one step as a community to kind of put this issue front and center, and we want to bring other people with us. This is a more than merrier type of exercise. It's not an issue we want to own. We want to bring as many people along with us, and bring new leaders to the fore who can help institutionalize this work globally.
Yeah. So for my final thought, I guess, I think one thing that's important to note, a distinction that I've relied on a lot, is by a colleague of mine, Gil Ayal. He has this great book called The Crisis of Expertise, where one of the things he notes is that one of the big challenges that institutions face today is, like, a lot of the problems we're forced to confront are trans-scientific. And what this means is, like, they're questions that you can formulate and discuss them in empirical terms by field of statistics and statistical models and stuff, but they're also turn in a really fundamental way on moral and political values, and in a way that you can't really eradicate the moral and political dimension from those problems. So questions about acceptable risk with respect to school closures and things like this, for instance. There's a dimension to those questions that is based on, well, what is the information we have about spread of COVID-19? How transmissible is it for different stakeholders, for children, for people who are likely to be teachers? So there are all sorts of empirical bits that are relevant, that are really germane, that are fundamentally important to the question about school closures. And you can frame that question in a really technical way. But there's also a moral and political dimension with respect to these, with respect to that decision, and there are real trade-offs that we have to work through. And Ayal argued, I think correctly, that as politics has become more scientized, then science has become more politicized. So as more and more decision making is based on these kind of empirical facts and scientific inquiry and stuff, then the question of who gets to become an expert and on what basis becomes much more important and live. And then I also just want to really quickly double click this point that KL made about how engagement, both at all levels of scientific production and then communication of scientific results. It's not just the case that more is better in a really simplistic way. Like, how you do this actually matters. There are definitely ways in which people can do science communication, for instance, in ways that cause more harm than good. And so I walked through some of those earlier in the conversation. So it definitely matters how you do it, and this is why it's really important for scientists to and other stakeholders and institutions to really lean into what is the evidence that we have on how to do this effectively. And as Chris noted, I think it's important to look at models beyond just the United States. There are a whole bunch of stakeholders who are confronting similar problems. There are a lot of people who are testing out ways to respond to those problems. And there's a lot of promising avenues that we see both in the United States and all across the world, models that institutions can learn from and draw from. And I think it's really important for us to really both look at what people are doing and learn lessons from people who are doing things well, and look at the evidence that we have about what works and what doesn't work, and really let that evidence guide how we approach engagement with different stakeholders.
I'm really glad you convened with your co-authors and to pursue this this analysis and list of recommendations. And I'm hoping we can revisit some of these issues and opportunities. One that I saw in India almost 10 years ago, I was there studying cooking pollution, was there's a network of about 1 million people called ASHA, accredited social health activists. They're local women trained to be sort of the sensory apparatus for the public health agencies in India. They live in all these rural villages, and they're the kind of interface that is local, is building trust, and is connected, integrated with the bigger knowledge base on how you prevent childhood mortality and the like. Just one of many examples of how we could learn by crossing, getting outside our borders, getting outside our disciplines. Thanks so much to all of you. This is a wrap for this edition of Sustain What, and there will be more on this subject. Onward with the day. Take care.
Thank you, and anytime.
Hold on a sec. Hold on.